Those are quite the stories. They're familiar to some of us maybe not. We seem to be confronted with wildly differing perspectives on the same situation, the same stories, the same statements that people make every week. Again this week, like many weeks, this week's news cycle reported two diametrically opposed narratives. One perspective is that this nation lived through a violent insurrection following an act of brutal sedition. The other perspective describes the same event as legitimate political discourse. That is a tongue twister. Fortunately, for anyone who is looking for what really happened, there's ample evidence in videos and video footage of that day, and it's easily accessible for anyone who wants to know and make a rational judgment. But the same kinds of diametrically opposed assessments of people and situations and things were already entrenched in the time of Jesus. There's nothing new under the sun. When the religious folk looked on the average working class citizens, they said, "This crowd doesn't know the scriptures. Damn them all." Now that's from the Gospel of John, expletive and all. Jesus, on the other hand, when considering the same people, many of whom followed him, had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. We find those words in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 9. So completely differing perspectives. Jesus lived in a time in which there were multiple societal strata. We think we live in a polarized have and have not culture, but here is a very rudimentary look at the culture of first century Palestine. The governing Roman Empire looked a little bit like this. Okay, so the top, there was the emperor, the ultimate dictator, had the ultimate authority. Under him, the regional territories were controlled by kings, who were friends or allies of Rome, or governors supported by the Roman army. So that's who Augustus was at the time when Jesus was born. Then under that were the prefects. They were put in place to govern the province, each province. That's who Pontius Pilate was, the leader who condemned Jesus to crucifixion. Now, to carry out the orders of the prefects were the local leaders, the highest of which was the high priest. So now not only did the high priest ensure that the prefects' orders were carried out, they had tasks to negotiate with the people. Okay, so the people who actually hated Rome, but they were subservient to Rome because those were their supervisors. Then under those, there were religious authorities, the scribes, Pharisees, even the tax collectors came out of that, under that. And finally, right at the bottom, were the masses or the multitudes, the ordinary people. Those are the ones who constituted most of Jesus' followers. We are not part of an elite, widely respected movement historically. So that's a very superficial picture, but what's clear is that there is a distinct pyramid with the emperor right on top, and way down below the ladder are the normal people or the ordinary folk. And this could be categorized much more simply like this. The elites, the inordinately wealthy who made the rules, the masses or the multitude who struggled and were disenfranchised were the ones who were ruled. And in between were the middle managers who were kind of comfortable, at least economically stable. They were the enforcers, the implementers of all of what Rome wanted to have happen. So keep that in mind when considering this text that Donna just read for us. It has always been the ruling class, and sometimes the middle managers who got preferential treatment, who got the backstage passes, so to speak, never the little people. From the Luke 18 and 19 scriptures, we heard about three kinds of people whom Jesus lifted as worthy of his attention. And then he followed that with statements that were completely countercultural. If we're used to hearing these stories, we might not get that. But given this rigid structure, it was completely unheard of what he said. So he specifically calls attention to children, to a person with a disability, and to a corrupt extortioner. Wow. Okay, now those people should never have gotten a backstage pass, right? No audience with someone deemed a celebrity, that's for sure. So when the parents brought their babies to Jesus for blessing, Jesus' very own disciples scolded them. It's the word that's used, scolded. Children didn't have a protected status in that culture. They were even more vulnerable than children are today. But Jesus, he'd have none of that. He goes out of his way to take note of the children, to speak with them, to pay attention to them. And he urges every adult who wants to be part of God's kingdom to become like a child. Well, they didn't pay attention to children in that culture, except for how they served the patriarchy. So maybe now they would have to start paying attention. Secondly, what an embarrassment this blind man was as he shouted to get Jesus' attention. What a blight on the image which the disciples or the leaders of this Jesus movement wanted to maintain. Some people are just interruptions, and they just impede progress. Again, the word used is scolded. They scolded this man, this one who was already on the margins, who had already been cast aside, who wasn't really taken into consideration. That's the assessment of the people who headed up Jesus' procession. And what was Jesus' response? He stops. So if he stops, but he's at the head of, or the central to this procession, what else happens? Everyone else has to stop as well. He calls the man over so he can talk to him. And after he says, "So what exactly do you need?" The man says, "I just want to see." And Jesus declares, "Receive your sight. Your faith has healed you." Now, Jesus intentionally brings faith into this equation because that term was reserved for the religious, the educated, those who were righteous. They had faith. But here, this one, this despised one with a disability, yes, that one, lifted to the level of worthy, just as worthy as those who already considered themselves worthy. So next, a corrupt extortioner. Okay, really? Certainly we can't embrace those who promote injustice. Tax collectors were known to collect a whole lot more than what they really owed Rome. So this tax collector was rich. He was determined, though, he had to see this Jesus because somehow he was drawn to him. And he thought, I can do that quite inconspicuously. I'm going to just hide in a tree. But Jesus kind of knew where the outsiders hung out, even if it was in trees. And again, he stops. And he calls to this despised extortioner and called him by name. "Zacchaeus," he said. Immediately, the people around him began to mutter and said, "What? With this criminal? He's corrupt." All kinds of judgment was floating around. And before Jesus could even talk to Zacchaeus, except to say that he's coming to his house, this repentant extortioner begins to confess. "I give half of my possession to the poor, and if maybe I've cheated someone, I'll repay 4 times as much." Other translations use the word defrauded for cheated. And to me, fraud sounds a whole lot worse than cheating. We do that on an exam in a classroom. But defrauding, okay, that's another level. Jesus declares salvation and bestows it on this hated extortioner. That was revolutionary. Giving to the poor, admitting a person or a group of people, and righting that wrong is powerful. This about face didn't happen because Jesus rebuked him or criticized him or shamed him in front of the crowd. Not at all. It was a voluntary action simply by being in the presence of Jesus. Taking time for disregarded children, meeting the needs of someone who is considered an embarrassment, bestowing salvation on a repentant defrauder is how Jesus rolls. Jesus sees people, acknowledges them regardless of who they are, their class, or anything, and definitely not dependent on what other people think about them. He gives them that backstage pass. That makes no sense in a culture in which enormous divides exist, whether that was in ancient Palestine or whether that is today. Whether that's financial disparity, political polarization, or fomented division between people of differing origins, races, economic levels, faith expressions, gender identities, or ideologies. There is nothing new under the sun among people. To follow Jesus continues to be an invitation into this upside-down kingdom, recognizing we are not a part of an influential and mainstream movement. It's a movement where everyone matters. You don't have to be part of the 1 or the 3 or the 5%. Being part of this revolutionary movement encourages us that backstage passes are the norm in Jesus' economy and in his theology. They're distributed generously, without exception, and quite regularly. That includes you. It includes me. It won't make headlines, but it is real. Keep your eyes open for your backstage pass. And when you have those, pass them on to others. Return that. Take Jesus' example and pass them out. And when this happens, we can say with a great deal of assurance that salvation has come to this house